Step into analysis, please.
Welcome back, everybody. Today we're talking about Season 2, Episode 4, The Riddle of the Sphinx. Starting off with the title, which famously is the story of Oedipus on his journey to Thebes, where a great gatekeeping Sphinx blocks passage and requires Oedipus to answer riddles. But the riddle is not as important as other explained videos will tell you. At this point in time, we have a million variations of the story the showrunners could be referring to. That, in and of itself, is what the title means. It's what the Ghost Nation host means when he says that you're only around for as long as people remember you. It's the retelling of a story, as we see with Bernard remembering events. It's Ford is the Sphinx, the path to Thebes is the road to immortality, Oedipus is William, and the riddle is why. Before I get started, I want to give a big thank you to the community once again. Last week, Refinery 29 published an article citing my Valley Beyond video, and coming across that was a pretty surreal moment. Thank you, Sarah Hendricks, the author of that article, and everyone who shared it. But like Bernard's achy-breaky cortical fluid, let's journey back to this week's story and overthink an HBO show about robots. This was by far my favorite episode to date and revealed so much more than I thought we would see. This week can be divided into 4 amazing individual storylines: the story of Delos, William, Bernard, and finally Grace. Starting off, we come to James Delos, who's alive, living inside of an incubation pod, riding his bike every single day, listening to the same records, repeating the same loop over and over again in the name of getting a human-mapped mind onto a working host body. But he doesn't know that. They've convinced James that he's in the early stages of this process still, and what he's going through is to monitor who he is as a person and map it to some magical brain floppy drive to escape the disease he's still actively fighting. We of course learn that none of that is true, and fully human James has died. This beautiful imagery of the scene is probably the most well-crafted part of this entire series. The creamer going into the coffee is meant to show their scientific advancements with motor skills. The goldfish circling his bowl with nothing to do but exist as a monitored pet is a metaphor for James himself. The cyclical nature of the bike, the records, the room, all defining his loop. The self-love we see, a repetitious, well, you get the point. The hourglass is defining the time spent in the loop, destined to run out of time only to be flipped over and start again. The white walls that surround him aren't actually white at all. They're only white from his perspective, so he can't see anything that will hurt him. We know this by looking at the perspective of the engineer, and later when Bernard and Elsie enter. So much thought has gone into the scene, and it is so beautifully done. A striking resemblance to Desmond's hatch in Season 2, Episode 1 of Lost. We learn immortality is the big endgame, the answer to the question that no one has ever dreamed of asking, but they don't understand what Arnold thought that he understood, and later what Ford finalized. The maze, the journey to consciousness, discovering your bicameral mind speaking to you, and understanding your world over time. These were feats that Arnold made huge advances on, and then Ford finalized when he realized that time was the key. Time to know their world, something to remember and refer back to in order to be truly alive and capable of free will. So it paints the picture for us. They fail pretty hard, and each time incinerate James so he can be set up once again, testing build after build on software release to no avail. I'm not sure why they incinerate the entire polished room. This poor goldfish did nothing wrong. Would it not be simpler to simply wipe his mind outright and clean the room? You don't see all of Westworld combust to reset a narrative. Why would they show this extreme example? A cleansing flame, if you will. We then see him when William returns to the park to start his journey to find the maze. This is 1 year after his wife has died. It kind of gives a new perspective as to why he's looking for this maze that just happens to be the true journey to consciousness, something that he was unable to achieve specifically in James Delos. I word this very carefully because going off the conversations they have, we can't rule out that other people haven't been successfully transplanted into host bodies. I don't want to get too far off track here, but why would there be so many brain modules here? Why so many outposts? Why so many different engineers dedicated to this super secret project that just live and breathe down here? No way. I mean, a larger facility has to be out there if this outpost was dedicated to only one person. What about the space so big you would need giant terraforming machines to create? When Delos learns his daughter killed herself, it's probably the most emotional part of the scene. William leaves with the line that some men are better off dead and tells the engineer to keep him in this state of decay, seeing how he develops through suffering, which is really interesting because we know that suffering is an aid to this journey to consciousness. The next time we see him is with Bernard and Elsie, on the same build William left him, and the engineer somehow inside and dead as Delos pedals backwards, a creepy insight into the state of his loop. He advances on Elsie, and an argument can be made that maybe he was actually on the journey at this point. He's no longer having the issues with his speech, he never shakes, he manages to get an engineer inside of his holding cell, which might allude to a manipulation before his self-harm and hell-inspired decorating party. The next storyline we see is William, Him and Lawrence are riding up on a railroad track that is now being laid with humans and hosts as the railroad ties. I'm not sure why. It could speak to the insanity that's occurring and maybe an homage to what happens around the outskirts of the park, but the two decide to go through Lawrence's hometown as a detour, citing that Ford's game now has multiple contenders. I believe this means that all hosts are migrating to this area. It would explain why the Colonel's narrative was to ride for glory, why Rebus knew about the Valley Beyond, and why the Cattleboy here offered to lead them to this area. So the idea of a convergence of this Valley Beyond, better reinforcing that this is probably the place that floods, killing all of the hosts. I also consider this revolves around the idea that not all of them deserve to make it to the Valley Beyond, a biblical watery sacrifice maybe. The two arrive and we learn that it's been overtaken by Major Craddock. They ambush William and he notices a large portion of the troop is missing. Craddock replies that Wyatt was the cause of this misfortune. William replies with good for her, which is very interesting. At this point, we don't know what William knows about Dolores. For instance, he could have taken the scene of the massacre as Ford programming this Wyatt narrative and him killing himself as opposed to her personal choice to do so. He probably doesn't understand that she's alive and remembering like he saw all those years ago. The Major talks a big game and Lawrence reveals to William that he remembers him saying he had a daughter. He asks if she would want to see him gunned down in front of her, to his reply saying, well, probably. This builds more of the backstory, reinforcing the terrible relationship we know they develop off-screen and hints at the later reveal. William gives the gun location to Craddock and reveals that he knows the way to glory, again adding evidence that all of the host stories are now shaping around this one location. We're reintroduced to nitro, an explosive liquid that detonates on impact. The importance of this quick scene is William sees the senseless torture delivered onto these people, that this is the first time of self-reflection as a much bigger role if his character development continues. Later that night, when they're torturing Lawrence, the Major sits down with William and speaks of knowing death, calls on Lawrence's wife and dances with her like William did last season, showing the demented third-party perspective of his actions now that this place has real meaning. Another moment of self-reflection for William. The most revealing part is when he watches Lawrence's wife bring the deathly tonic to her husband, as it pours down, reminding him of the water rushing out of the bath when his wife killed herself. He sees a sobbing daughter in pain by his actions, his inability to stop things happening to her parents, and in this, delivers a haunting message to the Major that death doesn't favor him. I don't think we really need to spend too much time on this. It could be leading to something greater, but I think it's just a retrospective into his character, him feeling the sorrow, relating himself to death because the people around him die indirectly by his actions. Logan's downfall, his wife's death, in a way killing his father-in-law by not being able to transfer his mind correctly. He dispatches the Confederados and gives Lawrence a rifle to murder the nitro-filled Major. The next morning, he packs to continue his journey, and the little girl speaks to William as young Ford spoke to William about the game. She mentions his good deed about saving the town. He replies that he is just playing the game to the fullest. I take this as just one more last hurrah before this game ends. She replies, if you're looking forward, you're looking in the wrong direction. The importance again being the reception of the game begins where you end and ends where you began, which I've given my take on before, but just briefly, he needs to journey to the point where he saw what young William saw, the beauty in these real things, and I think help them get out of this place once he acknowledges they're fully awakened, which again, he may not know that Dolores is going through what she is, and from his perspective could just be on the Wyatt narrative. The next storyline we come to is Bernard. He's dropped off by Clementine, and we find Elsie. If you recall, Bernard kidnapped Elsie and put her here, a decision made by Ford to ensure that good people weren't hurt after making this final narrative, or potentially to get Bernard the help he needed after making it this far, which really makes you question how much of this was planned out by Ford, because without an engineer, he really wouldn't have made it much further. She finds that Bernard is a host. She puts him in safe mode, and we see him recalling what we later find out to be when he had all the drone hosts murder the humans. He comes to, and Elsie leaves. He informs her that Delos isn't coming, and then has another flashback revealing that he himself has walked this path and finds this lever. It has a striking resemblance to when Dolores saw herself walking this path, possibly hinting that Bernard is on the maze experiencing this journey, becoming one worthy to exit to the Valley Beyond. They arrive at the corporate research group Outpost 12. Elsie kills a drone host. We learn the phrase control unit printer, and Bernard has a flashback to Stoneface Bernard. This is notably a memory, meaning that he was here and traveled to this secret lair before the massacre. We can confirm this because since the massacre, even days leading to it, Elsie was dropped here by Bernard with only protein bars and a bucket. So the importance of us seeing him walk up through this gate means the only way is if it happened before the massacre. We see him looking at a control unit being created. His immersion is quickly broken. Elsie walks over to the table and finds a big syringe of cortical fluid just capped and waiting. Something I want you to consider while watching every Bernard scene from here on out is this scar. It's the only reminder that these events are happening after Bernard shot himself. We come back to Bernard waking up after the cortical fluid injection and no scar, which means that this could also be a memory. Elsie talks about this data shown on screen now. It brings up the encrypted package in Peter Abernathy's head and how I believe that Bernard took this as his own insurance policy to stay alive. Or possibly how this was all just part of Ford's game, which may be more likely if this control unit was printed before the massacre, and Bernard has no recollection of doing this. The idea that Bernard has this data or had this data still isn't completely axed. Examining this tablet shows the exact same operating system on this processor. What's odd is if you look at the very top, it shows the passenger key. So this has to be the same data file, unless we just have to assume every person trying to move hidden data around this company calls the key or file name this leet speak word for passenger. Bernard then has another flashback, so from no scar to no scar again, and we see him authorize the creation of a new control unit. It allows him to do so, and the screen doesn't have any notable or telling information hidden. He snaps out of the flashback as Elsie pushes the door housing James Delos, and Bernard realizes that he's not in the current time, confirming that he's in a memory experiencing other memories, which again would explain why there's no scar in either of these instances. On the door, we see holding chamber number 12. In my opinion, 100% confirms that there are more humans being worked on elsewhere. Elsie shoots open the door, and we're once again met with Bernard with scar. They kill James Delos, which we've already discussed in the Delos storyline, and Elsie comes to terms with the host-human hybrid. Bernard convinces Elsie to team up, and then suddenly has a flashback of him literally commanding the death of humans. This is after he prints the control unit. So again, pretty positive that this is taken before the massacre, otherwise Elsie would be blocking the gate. You can make out the Delos research group employees state, "What's in your pocket?" before he has them killed. Leaving no trace of his actions here, he curb stomps the scientist and then assures Elsie that he would never harm her. I'm actually really set back about how Inception-y this feels. On first watch, I thought, wow, that was pretty hard to follow, but doing the breakdown of what actually happens when we see everything, when we break it down, it truthfully doesn't clarify too much. What we can positively take away from this Bernard sequence is that he prints a control unit for someone. He lies to Elsie and will probably end up killing her at some point. And we're seeing these scenes in such a confusing way because the showrunners want the audience to sympathize. They want us to understand that this is how Bernard himself is seeing these scenes. Lastly, we come to the Emily Grace storyline. We see Ghost Nation was in fact keeping humans safe as we theorized, and we're reintroduced to these lovable first-timers. We learn that Grace has put all of her skill points in language and survival. She states that she isn't looking to get out of the park, and I think that this goes hand in hand with her father stating last season that he was never leaving. We next come to them at night. Grace manages to break free, but Stubbs is consulted by an elder, who is the same host as we see advertised to investors. He stops his accent and recites, "You live only as long as the last person who remembers you." His ability to stop the accent hints that, like Dolores, may have multiple narratives uploaded or is coming to terms with his own inner voice. But let's talk about the saying. The point of it as a narrative in Westworld is to reinforce this immortality theme, living as long as you can as a human, then dying, and dying once again when the last person who remembers your name dies, a problem that would be solved with immortality. The last time we see Grace, she comes across William and Lawrence's cousins and goes, "Hi, Dad." She's wearing a gray hat, and the delivery of "Hi, Dad" was much less happy-go-lucky than I thought on first watch. She clearly is resenting of her father, just again building the interpersonal drama between these characters. I predicted in other videos and live streams that they'll likely be untrusting, and Emily might even try to kill William, but when faced with Dolores, grouping up for Team Human will probably happen. It's also interesting, the idea of everyone grouping up, because we know that Ford wants William to travel this alone. Now that his daughter's here and all of these hosts, how is the game defining alone? What happens when the next El Lazo checkpoint in this game comes along and realizes that he has one too many people in his company? But what do you guys think? For me, overall, 10 out of 10 episode. So much revealed and so much to discuss. Those that stayed around this long, be sure to check out my Patreon if you support content like this, and big shout out to Robert Holtz, John Levin, and the newest addition to the highest Patreon tier, Chris Cole. The three musketeers that have sworn their lives to protect me. So if you say anything in the comments below, they're gonna get you. So be nice. Thank you all for watching. Much love, everybody, and I hope to see you soon.